The first human ship to arrive at the world called Kepri did not come in triumph or terror, and it did not announce itself with the geometry of conquest that the older species had learned to fear. It came slow, its drives throttled down until the glow was a modest ember rather than a wound in the dark, and it carried a name chosen not to threaten or flatter, but to remind the crew why they had crossed so much night. The hull bore scars from micrometeor impacts that had been patched rather than polished away, and the vessel's lines were practical instead of graceful, a tool shaped by hands that expected to fix what broke rather than discard it. Long before any sensor pinged, long before any signal was sent, the people aboard were already aware of the truth that would shape the next centuries. They were not alone, and neither were the ones who waited below. Kepri had been charted by others centuries earlier, catalogued and categorized and quietly ignored. Its orbit was eccentric but stable, its oceans shallow and mineral-rich, its continents broken into archipelagos like scattered thoughts. It hosted a biosphere that used silicon lattices in ways carbon chemists had once dismissed as impossible, and its dominant sapient species had built cities of resonant stone that sang to themselves under tidal stress. The interstellar community had watched from a distance, exchanged data packets full of cautious adjectives, and decided that contact would be expensive and yield little. Kepri lay far from the trade spirals and lacked the kind of rare isotopes that justified diplomatic risk. So the world was left to its own cycles, observed but untouched, a footnote in databases maintained by entities that measured value in efficiencies and margins. Humanity found Kepri by accident, the way it found so many things that later defined it. A navigation error during a survey mission had forced the ship called Wayfarer's Ledger to recalculate its route, and in doing so, it passed through a region of space that older charts marked with outdated caution. The sensors aboard the ship were newer, built by teams who had learned to distrust assumptions, and they caught the subtle gravitational harmonics of an inhabited world. The crew argued not about whether to look closer, but about how to do so without becoming the sort of visitors history would condemn. They had read the records of first contacts gone wrong, had studied the failures of those who arrived with superior firepower and inferior patience. They had also read the quieter stories, the ones buried under more dramatic collapses, where two species met and chose to keep meeting. Command of Wayfarers, Ledger belonged to Senka Morado, a woman whose name carried the cadence of an old coastal language from a drowned Earth shoreline. She had grown up hearing stories about storms and stubborn harbors, about communities that rebuilt after each wave because leaving was not an option. Her authority on the ship was not enforced by ritual or threat, but by a web of trust spun over years of shared risk. When the ship's sensors confirmed sapient activity on Kepri, she convened the crew not in the command well, but in the mess, where decisions were made over recycled coffee and the hum of life support. She did not frame the situation as an opportunity or a danger. She framed it as a responsibility that could not be delegated. The species below called themselves the Ket, a word that in their tonal language meant both people and process. They experienced the world through vibrations as much as through light, their bodies tuned to the frequencies of stone and water. Their architecture was grown rather than built, coaxed from the planet's crust through patient resonance. Their politics were slow, deliberative, rooted in councils that could take seasons to reach consensus. They had noticed the watchers in the sky long before the Wayfarer's Ledger arrived, had felt the faint echoes of distant engines ripple through the planet's mantle. They had debated what those echoes meant, whether they were accidents or omens. When the human ship entered orbit, the Ket were ready not because they had planned for this specific moment, but because their culture valued readiness as a form of respect. First contact did not begin with words. It began with math, with pulses sent and received, with patterns that demonstrated an understanding of primes and ratios. The humans sent simple sequences, then waited, allowing the silence between messages to stretch without rushing to fill it. The Ket responded with variations that showed not only comprehension but curiosity, introducing harmonics that challenged human analysts to expand their models. The exchange unfolded over days, each side revealing a little more of its cognitive architecture, like dancers circling before committing to a shared rhythm. When at last the humans transmitted a representation of themselves, abstracted into geometric approximations to avoid imposing visual assumptions, the Ket replied with a representation of their cities as living systems, emphasizing flow over form. On the surface of Kepri, in a city grown around a deep tidal basin, a council gathered in a chamber where the stone walls hummed softly with the planet's heartbeat. Among them was Taev Shun, a mediator whose role was to translate not just language, but intent between factions that valued different aspects of Ket tradition. Taev's body bore the subtle asymmetries that marked a life spent near active fault lines, bones reinforced by mineral deposits that formed in response to constant vibration. Taev listened to the incoming signals through the chamber's resonance plates, feeling the patterns ripple through their own frame. There was no fear in the messages, no assertion of inevitability. There was something else, harder to categorize, a quality that suggested choice. When verbal language was finally attempted, it was after weeks of calibration and shared problem-solving. The humans sent a lexicon built from shared experiences, concepts anchored in the physics both species obeyed. The Ket responded with their own lexicon, careful to include context markers that conveyed relational meaning. Misunderstandings were frequent but rarely catastrophic, corrected through patient iteration. The first human voice the Ket heard belonged not to a diplomat trained in rhetoric, but to Senka Morado, who insisted on speaking for herself rather than through layers of abstraction. Her words were translated into vibrations that carried her intent as much as her syntax. She spoke of travel, of curiosity, of the knowledge that survival depended on cooperation, even when it was inconvenient. Humanity's reputation among the stars at that time was ambiguous. They were known as adaptable to the point of recklessness, capable of enduring environments that would have killed others, prone to forming attachments that complicated calculations. Some saw this as a flaw, others as a resource to be exploited. Few saw it as a philosophy. The Wayfarer's ledger carried no weapons beyond what was necessary to deflect debris, a fact that puzzled observers who equated preparedness with armament. Senka Morado made no effort to hide this. When asked, through layers of translation, how humans defended themselves, she spoke of redundancy and repair, of alliances maintained through mutual aid rather than deterrence. It was not a complete answer, but it was an honest one. The Ket Council debated the implications of contact with a species that described defense in such terms. There were those who argued that this was merely another strategy, a veneer over inevitable competition. There were others who felt the resonance of the human signals carried an unfamiliar consistency, a willingness to commit resources without immediate return. Taev Shun found themselves considering an old Ket proverb about open hands, about how showing one's grip was empty could be either an invitation or a warning, depending on context. They requested a demonstration, not of power, but of restraint. The demonstration took the form of a problem. Kepri's star was entering a phase of increased flare activity, a cycle the Ket had managed for millennia through adjustments to their cities' resonance patterns. However, recent shifts in the planet's orbit, subtle but cumulative, threatened to amplify the effects beyond manageable thresholds. The Ket had the data, but lacked the modeling tools to predict the long-term consequences. They presented this challenge to the humans not as a test, but as a shared concern, framing it within their cultural emphasis on process. Senka Morado did not consult distant authorities or request concessions. She ordered the Wayfarer's ledger's computational capacity to be dedicated to the problem, diverting resources from the ship's primary mission without hesitation. Human analysts worked alongside Ket-resonant scholars through a mesh of translated concepts and shared visualizations. They argued they made mistakes, they corrected them. They discovered that the Ket's intuitive grasp of planetary harmonics complemented human expertise in chaotic systems, each filling gaps the other did not know it had. The solution that emerged was not a technological fix imposed from above, but a set of adjustments to existing practices, informed by new predictive models. It required effort from both sides and offered no immediate reward beyond continued stability. When the humans presented their findings, they did so with caveats and uncertainties clearly marked, resisting the temptation to overstate confidence. The Ket Council accepted the recommendations, not because they were flawless, but because the process by which they were developed aligned with Ket values. Taev Shun spoke in favor of formalizing contact, noting that the humans had engaged with the problem as partners rather than patrons. The decision was not unanimous, but consensus was reached through the slow accretion of agreement. A formal invitation was extended for a human delegation to visit the surface, under conditions that emphasized mutual vulnerability. The humans accepted, agreeing to limit their numbers and to submit to environmental adaptations rather than terraforming. The first human to set foot on Kepri was not Senka Morado, but Anselma Kwon, a systems engineer whose expertise in adaptive infrastructure had made her invaluable during the stellar flare modeling. She descended in a small shuttle, its landing thrusters calibrated to minimize disturbance to the surrounding stone. When the hatch opened, she stepped onto a surface that resonated under her boots in ways that made her teeth hum. She paused, grounding herself, aware that every movement was being felt as much as seen. The Ket delegation approached not in formation, but in a loose cluster, their movements synchronized to a rhythm Anselma could sense even if she could not name it. The meeting that followed was awkward and profound. There were gestures that translated poorly, moments when well-intentioned actions caused unintended dissonance. Anselma learned quickly to move with deliberation, to let the ground inform her pace. The Ket learned to interpret human facial expressions, mapping muscle movements to emotional states with analytical care. They shared food in a symbolic exchange, each sampling the other's sustenance through carefully prepared analogues to avoid biochemical harm. The act was less about nutrition than about acknowledging interdependence. News of the contact spread beyond Kepri, carried by data streams that other species monitored with varying degrees of interest and alarm. Some saw an opportunity to insert themselves into a new relationship, to leverage human openness for their own ends. Others dismissed the event as inconsequential, a minor interaction on a peripheral world. Humanity did not broadcast the encounter as a triumph. There were no grand announcements, no declarations of manifest destiny. Instead, the Wayfarer's ledger filed detailed reports emphasizing uncertainties and ethical considerations, cautioning against rapid expansion of contact without the consent of those involved. Within the human polity, debates ignited. There were voices that argued humanity should capitalize on its apparent goodwill to secure alliances before others did. There were voices that warned against overextending, citing the fragility of trust. Senka Morado found herself called upon to justify her decisions to committees that measured success in metrics she found increasingly inadequate. She responded with data, with testimonies from her crew, with the simple assertion that survival in a crowded universe required more than efficient extraction. It required relationships built on the recognition of shared vulnerability. On Kepri, life continued, altered but not overturned by the arrival of humans. The stellar flare cycle progressed, mitigated by the adjustments informed by human models. Ket children grew up with stories of the sky visitors who listened as much as they spoke. Taev Shun took on the additional role of liaison, spending long hours in chambers where human holograms flickered alongside resonance patterns. They found the humans' linear sense of time perplexing, their impatience with processes that took generations both admirable and concerning. Yet there was respect in the way humans deferred to Ket decisions, in their willingness to wait. The Wayfarer's ledger remained in orbit longer than planned, its presence becoming a familiar echo in Kepri's mantle. Repairs were made, supplies rationed, schedules adjusted. The crew adapted, incorporating Ket insights into their own understanding of material science. They learned to feel the ship's vibrations differently, to interpret subtle changes as information rather than noise. Humanity was changing, not through conquest or assimilation, but through exposure to a way of being that challenged its assumptions. As the months passed, it became clear that this contact would not remain isolated. Other ships would come, drawn by curiosity or calculation. Other species would take notice, re-evaluating their dismissal of Kepri and of humanity. The foundations laid during these first interactions would be tested, strained, perhaps broken. But for now, there was a fragile equilibrium, a shared commitment to proceed with open hands, aware that what they held was not ownership, but possibility. The second human ship to arrive at Kepri did not belong to Senka Morado, and that difference mattered more than its mass or its engine's signature. It came on a trajectory calculated to be efficient rather than considerate, its arrival announced by sharper gravitational ripples that set the stone cities murmuring in uneasy chords. The ship was named Perseverant Yield, a title chosen by a corporate consortium that believed persistence was indistinguishable from entitlement. Its hull was smooth, its systems optimized, its crew trained to assess value rapidly and act before competitors could react. Where the Wayfarer's ledger had drifted, the Perseverant Yield arrived with purpose. The Ket noticed the difference immediately. The resonance monitors embedded throughout their cities registered unfamiliar patterns, abrupt and intrusive. Taev Shun felt the disturbance through the chamber floor while mediating a discussion on coastal reinforcement, and the sensation carried with it an instinctive unease. This was not merely another echo in the sky. This was a voice that spoke over others rather than with them. The council was convened in haste, a deviation from tradition justified by the potential consequences of delay. Human contact, once singular and carefully framed, now threatened to become plural and contested. Senka Morado learned of the incoming vessel through channels that bypassed her authority, a fact that strung more than the arrival itself. Humanity was not a monolith, despite how often others treated it as one, and internal divisions had a way of surfacing at the worst moments. The Perseverant Yield carried representatives empowered to negotiate extraction rights, research access, and long-term leases, armed with legal frameworks developed for encounters with less cohesive societies. They transmitted formal greetings to Kepri before acknowledging the Wayfarer's ledger, their message laden with assumptions about hierarchy and precedence. Morado responded with a request rather than a rebuke. She asked that all communication be routed through the established channels agreed upon with the Ket, citing respect for local processes. The reply she received was polite, firm, and dismissive, invoking human autonomy and the absence of binding authority beyond Earth's fragmented governance. It was a reminder that humanity's greatest strength, its diversity of approach, was also a source of vulnerability. The Ket were about to witness not just human openness, but human disagreement. On the surface, Anselma Kwon felt the shift before she understood it. The ground beneath the city of Shalrek began to vibrate in irregular patterns, subtle but persistent, like an unresolved argument. Ket engineers adjusted resonance dampers, compensating as best they could, but the source was external and intermittent. When the council informed her of the second ship, she listened in silence, aware that her presence now carried additional weight. She was no longer merely a guest. She was a reference point, an example of what human contact could look like. The Ket response to the perseverant yield was cautious, but not hostile. They acknowledged the ship's presence, reiterated their existing relationship with the Wayfarer's ledger, and requested time to deliberate before engaging in substantive discussion. This request was met with impatience thinly veiled as concern. The consortium representatives warned of missed opportunities, of other species that might move faster. They framed their proposals as mutually beneficial, emphasizing technological uplift and economic integration. The language was familiar to anyone who had studied the history of uneven encounters, and it set off quiet alarms among the Ket Council. Taev Shun found themselves tasked with interpreting not just words, but motivations. They compared the resonance of the perseverant yield's transmissions to those of the Wayfarer's ledger, noting discrepancies that could not be explained by technical variation alone. There was an intensity, a narrowing of focus, that suggested an endpoint already chosen. In Ket culture, process was paramount, and outcomes emerged through engagement. The idea of arriving with an outcome in mind was unsettling, akin to building a city without listening to the stone. Within the human ships, tensions escalated. The perseverant yield requested shared access to the orbital data collected by Morado's crew, framing it as a reasonable expectation among compatriots. Morado refused, citing agreements made with the Ket that governed data use and dissemination. The exchange grew heated, constrained only by protocol and the awareness that the Ket were listening, learning what humanity did when its interests diverged. Morado convened her crew not to plan a counteroffensive, but to confront the reality that their values were about to be tested in public. Humanity's broader interstellar reputation loomed over the situation. Other species monitored the exchange with interest, some eager to see whether humans would fracture under pressure, others curious whether their much-discussed adaptability extended to ethical consistency. The Ket, for their part, did not rush to judgment. They observed, analyzed, and discussed, drawing parallels to their own history of internal schisms resolved through resonance councils that forced conflicting parties to literally feel each other's arguments. The perseverant yield escalated by dispatching a small probe toward the planet's magnetosphere, ostensibly to gather atmospheric data. The probe's trajectory skirted agreed-upon boundaries, exploiting ambiguities in the initial contact framework. Ket sensors tracked the intrusion, and the resonance shifted from unease to alarm. This was not merely discourteous. It was a violation of the trust painstakingly established. The Council faced a dilemma: respond forcefully and risk escalation, or respond passively and invite further encroachment. Taev Shun proposed an approach grounded in Ket tradition, but adapted to the interstellar context. They suggested inviting representatives from both human ships to participate in a shared resonance session on the surface, a process normally reserved for resolving deep internal conflicts. The idea was radical. It required physical presence, vulnerability, and a willingness to be affected by the planet itself. Anselm Kwon supported the proposal, offering to facilitate human understanding of the process. Senka Morado agreed without hesitation. The perseverant yield's leadership hesitated, calculating risks, but ultimately consented, recognizing that refusal would reflect poorly in the eyes of observers. The landing of perseverant yield's delegation was markedly different from Anselma's earlier descent. Their shuttle prioritized speed over subtlety, its thrusters sending sharp vibrations through the stone. Ket engineers adjusted again, absorbing the impact, but the contrast was not lost on anyone present. The delegation emerged in environmental suits optimized for efficiency, their movements brisk, their attention divided between data feeds and the unfamiliar surroundings. Among them was Calrix Mendane, a negotiator whose reputation was built on closing deals in challenging environments. The resonance chamber prepared for the session was larger than usual, its walls tuned to amplify subtle vibrations. The Ket participants arranged themselves in a circle, their bodies aligned to create a balanced field. The humans were guided to positions opposite one another, Morado and Mendane facing not just the Ket but each other. Anselma stood between them, a literal and figurative bridge. The chamber's hum deepened, the planet's voice brought into sharper focus. The process began without preamble. The Ket activated the resonance plates, sending low-frequency vibrations through the chamber that interacted with each participant's body. For the Ket, this was familiar, a means of synchronizing perspectives. For the humans, it was disorienting. Morado closed her eyes, focusing on her breath, allowing the sensations to wash over her. Mendane stiffened, instinctively resisting, his suit systems compensating to maintain equilibrium. The difference was instructive. Taev Shun spoke, their voice translated into human auditory range while carrying its original vibrational context. They did not accuse or defend. They described the planet's response to the ship's presence, the way different approaches created different harmonics. They invited each human to articulate their intent, not in terms of objectives, but in terms of desired relationships. Morado spoke of partnership, of learning, of the long view. Mendane spoke of opportunity, of mutual gain, of the realities of interstellar competition. As he spoke, the chamber responded, certain frequencies clashing, others aligning. The Ket listened, feeling the words resonate or falter within the shared field. They did not judge immediately. Instead, they adjusted the resonance, introducing patterns that highlighted inconsistencies. When Mendane spoke of mutual benefit while advocating unilateral data collection, the vibrations grew harsh, the dissonance impossible to ignore. When Morado acknowledged the limits of her authority while committing to uphold agreements, the field stabilized. The process was not about winning an argument, but about revealing its structure. For Mendane, the experience was unsettling in ways he had not anticipated. Accustomed to controlling narratives, he found himself physically confronted by the consequences of his framing. The chamber did not care about his rhetoric. It responded to alignment or lack thereof. He attempted to adapt, reframing his proposals in more collaborative language, but the resonance remained unstable. It was not enough to change words without changing intent, and the Ket sensed the difference. Hours passed, marked not by clocks, but by shifts in the chamber's tone. Eventually, Taev Shun concluded the session, noting that the process had revealed significant divergence within humanity. They stated, calmly and without malice, that the Ket were willing to continue their relationship with humans who engaged through shared process, but would not consent to interactions that treated Kepri as a resource rather than a participant. This was not an ultimatum, but it was a boundary. The aftermath reverberated beyond the chamber. The Perseverant Yields delegation returned to orbit, its members shaken and divided. Mendane filed reports emphasizing the unpredictability of the Ket and the risks of continued engagement under such constraints. Morado, for her part, documented the session in detail, highlighting the value of the resonance process as a tool for conflict resolution. The data streams carrying these reports were intercepted, analyzed, and debated across human space. On Kepri, the Council assessed the outcome with characteristic deliberation. They recognized that humanity was not a single entity, and that choosing to engage with one faction over another would have consequences. They also recognized that disengagement was not a neutral act. The planet had been seen, noticed, and could not be unseen. The question was not whether others would come, but under what terms. Anselma Kwan felt the weight of this realization acutely. She had come as an engineer, a problem solver, and found herself enmeshed in questions of ethics and power. She spent long hours with Ket scholars, learning about past encounters between Ket factions that had nearly torn their society apart. She learned how those conflicts had been resolved not through dominance, but through processes that forced mutual recognition. She wondered whether humanity, with its faster tempos and fractured authorities, could learn the same lessons in time. Senka Morado faced scrutiny from human institutions that questioned her judgment. Some accused her of jeopardizing economic opportunities, of allowing alien sensibilities to override human interests. Others rallied to her defense, arguing that short-term gains achieved through coercion would undermine humanity's long-term survival. The debates were fierce, reflecting deep divides in how humanity understood its place in the cosmos. Morado remained resolute, not because she believed herself infallible, but because she believed the alternative was worse. The perseverant yield did not leave immediately. It lingered in orbit, its presence a constant reminder of unresolved tension. Its probe was recalled, but not destroyed, a gesture of partial compliance. Other human ships adjusted their routes, some drawn by the promise of a new world, others deterred by the complexity of the situation. The interstellar community watched, waiting to see which human approach would prevail. For the Ket, the arrival of the second ship accelerated internal discussions about preparedness. They revisited ancient protocols, adapting them for an era where visitors might not share their patience. They invested in better monitoring of orbital activity, in training mediators who could navigate not just resonance, but translation algorithms and legal frameworks. They did not militarize. Instead, they fortified their processes, believing that clarity of boundaries was a form of defense. The chapter of initial contact closed not with resolution, but with a widening field of possibilities. Trust had been tested, but not broken. Humanity had revealed both its capacity for openness and its propensity for overreach. The Ket had asserted their agency without resorting to force. The path forward remained uncertain, shaped by choices yet to be made. In the shared space between planet and ship, between stone and steel, the measure of open hands would continue to be tested. The crisis that forced a reckoning did not originate with humanity or the Ket, but it exposed the consequences of how both chose to act. It began far from Kepri, in a dense corridor of interstellar traffic, where autonomous freight lines intersected with migratory routes mapped by species older than human metallurgy. A chain failure in a poorly regulated logistics network caused a cascade of collisions, releasing a cloud of relativistic debris that no single authority claimed responsibility for. The cloud expanded, its trajectory shaped by stellar winds and gravitational gradients, until projections showed a non-trivial probability of intersection with the Kepri system within decades. It was slow catastrophe, the kind that rewarded foresight and punished complacency. The warning reached Kepri through fragmented channels. Some data arrived via the Wayfarer's ledger, relayed from human scientific networks that still valued Morado's assessments. Other fragments leaked from less reputable sources, distorted by speculation and opportunism. The perseverant yield received its own alerts, filtered through corporate risk models that framed the debris cloud as both hazard and leverage. The Ket detected nothing yet. The danger lay too far out, its vibrations lost in the background noise of the galaxy. But when the humans compared notes, the implications became clear. If the debris cloud intersected the outer system, it would destabilize Kepri's already delicate orbital balance, compounding the stellar flare risks they had only just learned to manage together. Senka Morado convened an emergency council, inviting Ket representatives to participate before any formal proposal was drafted. This in itself was a departure from standard human crisis response, which often favored rapid unilateral action. She argued, to skeptical ears within her own crew, that early inclusion was essential to maintaining trust. Anselma Kwan supported her, emphasizing that the debris cloud was not merely a technical problem, but a shared existential threat. The Ket agreed to engage, though some council members questioned the wisdom of investing resources in a problem that had not yet manifested within their sensory horizon. Taev Shun listened to the human explanations, feeling for resonance beneath the abstractions. The idea of danger that could not yet be felt challenged Ket intuition, which was grounded in immediate feedback from stone and water. However, the Ket were not strangers to long cycles. Their cities were built to anticipate stresses generations ahead, guided by models encoded in cultural memory rather than equations. When the humans translated the projected timelines into vibrational analogues, mapping future impacts onto familiar harmonic scales, understanding began to take root. The Perseverant Yield's response was swift and characteristically narrow. Its leadership proposed deploying a series of kinetic deflection arrays in the outer system, designed to fragment the debris cloud and redirect hazardous masses. The plan prioritized speed and control, relying on proprietary technology and automated decision-making. It made minimal reference to Ket consent, framing the intervention as necessary to protect human assets already invested in the system. In private communications, Calrix Mendane argued that decisive action would demonstrate human capability and justify expanded authority. Morado countered with a different approach. She advocated for a collaborative modeling effort that included Ket resonance scholars, aiming to understand not just the debris cloud's trajectory, but its interaction with the system's unique gravitational and vibrational characteristics. She warned that indiscriminate fragmentation could create secondary hazards, unpredictable resonances that might amplify rather than mitigate risk. Her proposal was slower, messier, and offered no single point of control. It also required sharing data that some human institutions considered sensitive. The disagreement played out across multiple forums, from encrypted channels to open interstellar assemblies. Humanity's internal divisions became increasingly visible, and other species began to weigh in, some offering assistance, others positioning themselves to exploit potential fallout. The Ket found themselves at the center of a debate not of their making, their world discussed in terms of probabilities and returns. Taev Shun felt a familiar dissonance, reminiscent of ancient conflicts when Ket factions had argued over land use without consulting the stone itself. In response, the Ket Council made a decision that surprised their human counterparts. They announced that no intervention would be permitted within the Kepri system without Ket participation in both planning and execution. This was not framed as a veto, but as a condition of engagement. They offered access to their resonance archives, millennia of data on how the planet responded to external perturbations, in exchange for full transparency from human actors. The offer was generous and risky, exposing cultural knowledge that could be misused. It was also a test. Morado accepted immediately, instructing her crew to prepare their datasets for integration. The Perseverant Yield hesitated, its leadership balking at the implications for proprietary control. Mendane attempted to negotiate carve-outs, proposing limited disclosure under strict terms. The Ket declined, their response polite but firm. Partial trust, they explained, was not stable enough to build upon when stakes were planetary. The resonance of the exchange made their position unmistakable. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected development. A third human ship entered the system, smaller than either of the others, its arrival understated. It was a cooperative research vessel funded by a coalition of academic institutions, its crew accustomed to operating without clear profit motives. Its captain, Rima Solis, requested permission to dock with the Wayfarer's ledger rather than establishing an independent orbit, signaling alignment before negotiation. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Solace brought with her a team of specialists in complex systems, people whose careers had been built on navigating uncertainty rather than eliminating it. She had followed the situation from afar, intrigued by reports of resonance-based mediation. Upon arrival, she requested an audience with the Ket Council, expressing interest not in leading an intervention, but in facilitating a shared understanding of the problem space. Her language was careful, her assumptions explicit. Taev Shun felt a subtle shift in the chamber's tone when Solace spoke, a softening that suggested potential alignment. With the addition of the research vessel, the collaborative modeling effort gained momentum. Human and Ket teams worked in parallel, then together, translating between mathematical simulations and resonance patterns. They discovered that the debris cloud's interaction with Kepri's system was more complex than initial projections suggested. Certain deflection strategies risked triggering resonant amplification within the planet's mantle, potentially causing widespread structural failure in the stone cities. Other strategies, slower and more precise, could guide the debris into stable capture orbits, dispersing risk over centuries rather than concentrating it in a single event. These findings put pressure on the Perseverant Yield's plan. The kinetic arrays, while effective in isolation, appeared dangerously blunt when considered in the full system context. Mendane disputed the models, questioning the validity of resonance data he did not fully understand. He commissioned independent analyses that, unsurprisingly, favored his preferred approach. The divergence in conclusions highlighted not just methodological differences, but epistemological ones. What counted as evidence depended on what one was prepared to feel. The Ket Council insisted on a joint review session, similar to the earlier resonance chamber meeting, but expanded to include multiple human factions. The session was unprecedented in scale, requiring adaptations to accommodate diverse physiologies. The chamber was augmented with translation fields and support systems, transforming it into a hybrid space where vibration, light, and sound interwove. Representatives from the Wayfarer's Ledger, the Perseverant Yield, the research vessel, and several observing species took part. The planet itself was invited into the conversation, its deep rhythms amplified and modulated. The experience was overwhelming for many participants. Data that had seemed abstract acquired visceral weight when mapped onto shared sensory fields. The consequences of certain actions were no longer lines on a graph, but waves of strain that rippled through bodies and minds. Some human delegates withdrew, unable or unwilling to engage at that level. Others found the experience transformative, their understanding of responsibility reshaped by direct encounter with planetary fragility. Mendane endured the session with visible discomfort. His attempts to compartmentalize failed in the face of feedback he could not ignore. When confronted with the projected resonance impacts of the kinetic arrays, he experienced not just intellectual doubt, but physical unease. For the first time, his confidence wavered. He did not concede immediately, but his rhetoric shifted, incorporating caveats and conditions that had been absent before. The outcome of the session was not a single agreed-upon plan, but a narrowed field of acceptable options. The kinetic arrays were not banned outright, but their use was constrained by thresholds defined collaboratively. Priority was given to strategies that distributed intervention across time and actors, reducing the risk of catastrophic failure. Implementation would require coordination among multiple ships, shared oversight, and ongoing adaptation based on feedback from the system itself. This framework challenged conventional human command structures. It blurred lines of authority, demanded patience, and reduced opportunities for unilateral credit. Some institutions balked, withdrawing support or threatening sanctions. Others adapted, seeing in the framework a model for managing complexity beyond Kepri. The research vessel's coalition committed resources, as did several independent human groups inspired by the process. The Perseverant Yields Consortium faced internal dissent, investors questioning the wisdom of pushing against a growing consensus. On Kepri, the Council ratified participation in the intervention, marking the first time the Ket had engaged in off-world system management. The decision was accompanied by rituals acknowledging the gravity of the choice, the acceptance that their world was now entangled with distant events beyond their direct perception. Taev Shun felt both pride and apprehension, aware that this step would irrevocably alter Ket history. As preparations began, the Wayfarer's ledger transitioned from observer to coordinator, its crew stretched thin but resolute. Anselma Kwon found herself leading a hybrid team, translating between engineering schematics and resonance protocols. She grappled with moments of doubt, questioning whether humanity deserved the trust placed in it. Each time, she returned to the work, guided by the belief that effort mattered even when outcomes were uncertain. The debris cloud remained distant, its slow approach a reminder that some crises unfolded on timescales that outlasted individual lives. The choices made now would echo far into the future, shaping not just Kepri's fate, but humanity's reputation as a neighbor among worlds. In the shared labor of anticipation and restraint, a different measure of strength emerged, one defined not by the ability to impose solutions, but by the willingness to be changed by the process of finding them. The first physical intervention began not with engines firing or structures unfolding, but with waiting. Human crews, accustomed to timelines measured in quarters and missions, found themselves recalibrating their sense of urgency, aligning with Ket models that treated decades as adjustable parameters rather than deadlines. The debris clouds projected into section point lay far beyond the orbit of Kepri's outermost satellites, a region where gravitational influences braided subtly and where small adjustments could cascade into long-term stability or ruin. The plan that emerged from the collaborative process required inserting guidance masses into that region, objects designed to interact gently with the debris over time, nudging trajectories rather than shattering them. It was an approach that demanded precision, restraint, and above all, trust that delayed results were still results. Construction of the guidance masses took place across multiple locations. Human fabrication facilities produced components optimized for modularity and repair, while Ket artisans shaped resonant cores grown from planet-derived materials. The integration of these elements was itself a negotiation, each side learning to accommodate the other's tolerances. Human engineers had to accept variability that could not be fully quantified, while Ket builders adapted to manufacturing processes that favored standardization. Anselma Kwon found herself mediating not just technical disagreements, but philosophical ones, reminding both sides that perfection was not the goal. Stability was. The Perseverant Yield remained in orbit, its role increasingly ambiguous. Some of its crew transferred to other vessels, uncomfortable with the shift away from decisive action. Others stayed, drawn by curiosity or a sense of obligation they could not articulate. Calrix Mendane faced mounting pressure from his superiors, demands for progress reports that justified continued investment. He responded with carefully framed updates, emphasizing risk mitigation and long-term positioning. Privately, he wrestled with a growing unease, the resonance session having left a mark he could not easily erase. As the first guidance mass was assembled, a test deployment was scheduled. The Ket insisted on a ceremonial acknowledgement, not as superstition, but as a way of aligning attention. The humans agreed, though some participated with polite skepticism. The ceremony involved synchronizing human and Ket monitoring systems, establishing a shared baseline of expectation. When the mass was released into its calculated trajectory, there was no dramatic spectacle. It drifted, engines silent, its presence registered only in the gradual shift of sensor readings. The lack of immediate feedback was unsettling for those accustomed to instant confirmation. Weeks passed. Data trickled in, subtle changes accumulating slowly. The debris cloud's internal dynamics began to alter, its densest clusters responding to the guidance mass's influence. The models predicted this, but seeing it unfold in real time validated the collaborative approach. The Ket monitored the planet's resonance, watching for any signs of unintended coupling. The stone cities remained stable, their hum unbroken. Confidence grew, cautious but real. This period of relative calm allowed deeper cultural exchange to resume. Human crew members spent extended rotations on Kepri's surface, learning the rhythms of Ket daily life. They observed how decisions were revisited rather than finalized, how dissent was held within structures designed to prevent fragmentation. Ket observers visited human ships, navigating corridors and interfaces built for different bodies and assumptions. They noted humanity's reliance on redundancy, the way systems were designed to fail gracefully rather than avoid failure altogether. Mutual understanding deepened, not through grand gestures, but through shared routines and minor frustrations. Yet beneath this progress, tensions simmered. Other species began to express concern about the precedent being set. The idea that a developing world could demand full participation in system-level interventions challenged long-standing hierarchies. Diplomatic messages arrived, some supportive, others veiled threats. Humanity found itself in an unfamiliar position, defending not its own sovereignty, but that of another. The debates within human space intensified, with some factions arguing that the Kepri collaboration was weakening humanity's negotiating position elsewhere. Senka Morado became a focal point for these anxieties. Summoned repeatedly to justify her actions, she articulated a vision of interstellar coexistence grounded in mutual constraint. She argued that unchecked power invited resistance, while shared responsibility fostered resilience. Her words resonated with some, infuriated others. She was praised as a pioneer and derided as naive, often in the same breath. Through it all, she remained anchored to the practical realities unfolding around Kepri, where theory was tested against stone and orbit. The Perseverant Yields Consortium eventually made a decision. Facing diminishing returns and increasing scrutiny, they ordered Mendane to secure a tangible stake or withdraw. Mendane requested one final audience with the Ket Council, framing it as an opportunity to realign. Taev Shun agreed, sensing that unresolved dissonance could yet destabilize the fragile equilibrium. The meeting took place in a smaller chamber, its resonance tuned to facilitate individual introspection rather than collective synthesis. Mendane arrived without his usual entourage, his demeanor subdued. He spoke candidly, acknowledging the limits of his previous approach without fully renouncing it. He expressed concern that the collaborative framework, while admirable, might leave humanity exposed to less accommodating actors. He asked whether the Ket understood the risks they were taking by setting such firm boundaries. Taev Shun listened, feeling the underlying fear beneath Mendane's words. They responded not with reassurance, but with perspective. The Ket, they explained, had faced extinction-level threats long before humanity's first flight. Their survival had depended not on controlling every variable, but on building systems capable of absorbing shock. Boundaries were part of that system, not obstacles to be removed. They invited Mendane to consider whether humanity's strength lay in dominance or in its capacity to adapt to new relational modes. The resonance in the chamber shifted as Mendane absorbed this. He did not emerge transformed, but something loosened. He admitted that the consortium's demands left little room for the kind of engagement unfolding at Kepri. He asked, quietly, what would happen if he chose to step outside that structure. Tay of Shun did not offer guidance. Choice, they reminded him, was most meaningful when uncoerced. In the weeks that followed, Mendane made his decision. He resigned his position, citing irreconcilable differences in strategic vision. The perseverant Yield received orders to depart the system, its role concluded. Some of its crew transferred to other missions, while a handful requested reassignment to the collaborative effort, their expertise too valuable to discard. The ship's departure was less dramatic than its arrival, its engines calibrated more carefully, its wake gentler. The stone cities felt the difference. The withdrawal was interpreted in various ways across the interstellar community. Some saw it as a failure of human cohesion, others as evidence of ethical evolution. The Ket Council marked the moment not with celebration, but with reflection, acknowledging both the relief and the uncertainty it brought. They understood that the absence of one actor did not eliminate future challenges. The debris cloud still approached, and others would surely come. As additional guidance masses were deployed, the intervention entered a new phase. Responsibility for monitoring and adjustment was distributed across a growing network of participants, human and otherwise. No single ship or species held the reins. The system responded with surprising stability, its complexity managed through continual feedback rather than centralized control. It was not efficient by traditional metrics, but it was robust. Anselm Kwon, overseeing the integration of new participants, reflected on how far they had come from the initial accidental encounter. She saw in the collaboration a microcosm of what interstellar society could become if it chose patience over extraction. She also saw the fragility of that vision, how easily it could be undone by fear or greed. Her resolve hardened, not into certainty, but into commitment. On Kepri, children began to incorporate stories of the sky collaborations into their play, using resonant stones to mimic orbital dynamics. Human crew members found themselves adopting Ket metaphors, speaking of processes and harmonics, where once they spoke of objectives and metrics. Change was uneven and incomplete, but it was real. The fourth chapter of this shared history closed without fanfare. The debris cloud's projected risk continued to diminish, its once threatening mass slowly teased into safer configurations. The stone cities endured, their hum steady. Humanity's presence at Kepri settled into something like normalcy, extraordinary only in retrospect. The measure of open hands was being recalibrated, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a practice sustained through effort, accountability, and the acceptance that strength could be found in choosing not to grasp. Time, which humans often treated as an adversary to be outrun or optimized, began to feel different around Kepri. The collaborative intervention unfolded across years rather than missions, and the longer arc changed the kinds of people who remained involved. Those driven by rapid advancement or decisive victories rotated out, replaced by individuals drawn to continuity, maintenance, and the quiet satisfaction of watching a system hold together. This gradual filtering was not intentional, but it shaped the character of the work more effectively than any policy could have. The guidance masses multiplied slowly, each new insertion informed by the accumulated behavior of the debris cloud. The cloud itself became less a singular threat and more a diffuse field of managed risk, its most dangerous elements shepherded into long elliptical paths that would take centuries to intersect anything of consequence. This outcome lacked drama. There were no singular moments of salvation, no clear point at which the crisis could be declared solved. Instead, there was an ongoing reduction of danger, measurable only through patience and sustained attention. For the Ket, this approach aligned naturally with their understanding of stewardship. Their cities had always required constant listening, adjustments made in response to subtle changes in resonance. What was new was extending that sensibility beyond their planet, treating the surrounding space as an environment rather than an empty buffer. Ket scholars began to develop new frameworks for off-world resonance, expanding concepts that had once been limited to stone and water. These ideas were shared freely within the collaboration, challenging long-held assumptions about ownership of knowledge. Human participants found themselves changed in less formal ways. Living and working alongside the Ket eroded habits of dominance that many had not even recognized in themselves. Meetings slowed, not because of inefficiency, but because listening took precedence over assertion. Arguments shifted from winning to refining. Some humans struggled with this, feeling unmoored without familiar hierarchies. Others found the change liberating, discovering capacities for patience they had never needed before. Senka Morado, whose career had become inseparable from Khepri in the public imagination, quietly prepared to step back. She understood that leadership, which lingered too long, risked becoming a bottleneck, and that the collaboration needed room to evolve beyond its founders. She began mentoring successors, not by appointing them, but by withdrawing from decisions that no longer required her intervention. The process was uncomfortable, forcing her to confront how much of her identity had been wrapped up in being necessary. Her departure from active command did not go unnoticed. Some interpreted it as abandonment, others as a strategic retreat. Morado addressed these concerns directly, explaining that the work at Khepri had reached a phase where distributed responsibility was not just possible but essential. She remained available as an advisor, but she no longer stood at the center. The Wayfarer's ledger was reassigned, its crew rotated, its symbolic role shifting from pioneer to one participant among many. This transition coincided with a new challenge, one that tested the collaboration's maturity. A neighboring system, home to a species known for aggressive expansion, announced plans to establish a transit hub whose projected traffic would intersect with the managed debris field. Their calculations assumed conventional intervention strategies and did not account for the delicate balance painstakingly achieved around Khepri. Initial communications were dismissive, their representatives expressing skepticism toward what they described as sentimental governance. The news unsettled both humans and Ket. The intervention had been designed to mitigate an existing hazard, not to absorb additional stress imposed by external actors. The prospect of another power disregarding the collaborative framework threatened to unravel years of work. Some human voices called for preemptive action, arguing that allowing the transit hub would undermine not just Khepri's safety, but the principle of shared stewardship. Others warned against escalation, noting that coercive measures would contradict the very values the collaboration claimed to uphold. The Ket Council approached the problem through familiar means, convening extended deliberations that included not only technical experts, but cultural historians and ethicists. They examined past moments when external pressures had forced rapid adaptation, identifying patterns of response that preserved cohesion without resorting to force. Taev Shun played a central role in these discussions, articulating concerns that blended pragmatic risk assessment with cultural memory. The challenge, they argued, was not to prevent others from acting, but to make the consequences of ignoring the collaborative framework impossible to overlook. Human participants contributed their own analyses, mapping potential traffic patterns and identifying points of leverage that did not rely on threat. A proposal emerged to invite the neighboring species into the existing monitoring network, offering access to data and modeling tools in exchange for participation in the stewardship process. It was a risky strategy, opening the collaboration to actors who might exploit transparency. It also aligned with the principle that exclusion often bred antagonism. The invitation was extended, carefully worded, and backed by evidence of the intervention's effectiveness. It emphasized not moral superiority, but practical benefit, demonstrating how shared management reduced long-term costs and instability. The response was delayed, then skeptical, then cautiously curious. Representatives arrived not in humility, but in calculation, seeking to evaluate whether participation served their interests. Their arrival introduced new friction. The species' decision-making culture valued speed and centralized authority, clashing with the collaborative's distributed processes. Meetings grew tense, progress slowed, and patience was tested on all sides. Some human and Ket participants questioned whether the effort was worth it, whether compromise with such actors risked diluting the collaboration's integrity. The turning point came not through argument, but through exposure. During a joint simulation session, the neighboring species, delegates experienced the resonance-mapped impacts of uncoordinated traffic on the debris field. The visualization translated abstract risk into cascading system failure, showing how their proposed hub could destabilize not just Kepri's system, but neighboring routes they themselves depended on. The experience was not as visceral as the Ket resonance chambers, but it was sufficient. Self-interest, once fully informed, aligned with restraint. Negotiations resumed with a different tone. The transit hub plans were revised, traffic corridors adjusted to avoid critical regions. In exchange, the neighboring species gained a role in the stewardship network, contributing resources and expertise. The collaboration expanded, becoming more complex and more resilient. It was no longer a human-Ket endeavor, but a multi-species experiment in shared responsibility. These developments reverberated widely. Other worlds and factions took notice, some seeking to emulate the framework, others attempting to undermine it. Humanity's role was scrutinized, alternately praised for its adaptability and criticized for inconsistency across contexts. The Ket became a reference point in interstellar discourse, their insistence on process cited as either admirable or obstructive depending on perspective. On Kepri itself, the changes manifested subtly. The planet's resonance patterns incorporated new frequencies from off-world monitoring arrays, expanding the sensory horizon of the stone cities. Ket children grew up aware not just of their planet's rhythms, but of distant movements that could one day affect them. This awareness was not framed as anxiety, but as connection. Anselma Kwan, now deeply embedded in the stewardship network, reflected on the improbability of it all. What had begun as an accidental encounter had evolved into a living system of relationships, fragile and imperfect, yet capable of absorbing shocks that would have shattered more rigid structures. She knew there were no guarantees that future conflicts could still erupt. But she also knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the idea of open hands had been tested and found, if not easy, then possible. As the managed debris field stabilized further, its threat receding into the background of long-term planning, attention turned to sustaining the collaboration itself. Mechanisms were formalized, not as rigid institutions, but as adaptable guidelines informed by ongoing practice. The work was never declared finished. Instead, it was accepted as a condition of living in a crowded universe, where survival depended less on claiming space and more on learning how to share it. The fifth chapter closed on a note of cautious continuity. No triumph, no final resolution, just a recognition that endurance was its own kind of success. The measure of open hands had expanded again, encompassing not just two species, but many, bound together by the shared understanding that holding on too tightly was often the surest way to break what mattered. Long after the debris cloud had been rendered a background concern rather than an imminent threat, Kepri continued to change in ways that were harder to chart. The most significant shifts were not recorded in orbital tables or resonance archives, but in habits of attention. The Ket had always listened to their world, but now that listening extended outward, braided with signals and patterns that originated beyond their star. Humanity, in turn, found that Kepri had altered how it listened to itself. The collaboration had become a mirror in which human contradictions were harder to ignore and, in some cases, harder to excuse. The stewardship network matured into something that defied easy categorization. It was not a governing body, nor a treaty organization, nor a market. It functioned through overlapping commitments, maintained by people who often disagreed about priorities but shared a baseline agreement about process. Decisions were rarely final. Instead, they were provisional states, revisited as conditions evolved. This unsettled observers who preferred clarity and permanence, but it proved adaptable in the face of uncertainty. Human participation diversified over time. New generations of crew members arrived who had grown up with Khepri as a case study rather than a novelty. For them, shared stewardship was not radical but normative, one model among many. They questioned earlier debates with a mix of respect and impatience, wondering why some issues had seemed so intractable. Their presence altered internal human discussions, shifting the center of gravity away from extractive assumptions. Not completely and not everywhere, but enough to matter. The Ket experienced their own internal transformations. Exposure to off-world systems accelerated debates about identity and continuity. Some worried that expanded engagement risked diluting traditions rooted in planetary intimacy. Others argued that tradition had always been adaptive, that refusing to evolve would betray the very processes that had sustained Ket society. These debates unfolded slowly, sometimes painfully, but they unfolded within structures designed to hold disagreement without collapse. Taev Shun, now older and carrying the accumulated strain of years spent at cultural fault lines, continued to mediate, aware that their role was less about guiding outcomes than about preserving space for listening. As the stewardship network stabilized, attention turned to formalizing knowledge transfer. The Ket Resonance archives, once guarded closely, were reorganized to allow selective access by non-Ket participants. This required developing translation frameworks that preserved context rather than flattening it into data points. Human scholars struggled with this at first, accustomed to extracting information from its cultural substrate. Over time, some learned to accept that understanding required immersion, that meaning was inseparable from process. In return, humans shared records of their own failures, not just successes. Case studies of collapsed colonies, of interventions that had backfired, of technologies deployed without sufficient ethical consideration. These were not offered as cautionary tales from a position of superiority, but as acknowledgments of fallibility. The exchange deepened trust in ways that polished narratives never could. Vulnerability, it turned out, was a currency that retained its value even in interstellar contexts. The neighboring species that had joined the stewardship network adapted unevenly. Their centralized structures chafed against the distributed model, but practical benefits kept them engaged. Over time, they began to experiment with hybrid approaches, integrating feedback loops inspired by Ket resonance practices. The changes were subtle and often contested internally, but they demonstrated that no culture remained untouched by sustained participation. Influence flowed in multiple directions, reshaping participants in ways none had fully anticipated. Senka Morado observed these developments from a distance she had chosen deliberately. No longer in command of a ship or project, she served on rotating advisory panels, her experience valued but not definitive. She found satisfaction in this reduced role, though it came with moments of melancholy. Watching others take up work she had once shepherded forced her to confront the impermanence of individual impact. Yet there was relief too, in knowing that the collaboration no longer depended on her presence. One of Morado's last formal contributions was a reflective analysis commissioned by a cross-species forum. Rather than outlining policy recommendations, she traced the evolution of trust at Khepri, identifying inflection points where different choices could have led to collapse. She emphasized how often outcomes hinged on restraint rather than action, on decisions not to exploit asymmetries of power. The document circulated widely, cited and criticized in equal measure. Some dismissed it as idealistic. Others treated it as a manual for survival in a universe where isolation was no longer an option. Anselma Kwan, whose life had become inseparable from the stewardship effort, faced her own reckoning. Years of sustained engagement had taken a toll, blurring boundaries between work and identity. She considered leaving, returning to more conventional engineering roles. What held her was not obligation, but curiosity. The system they were maintaining was alive in a way no machine had ever been, responsive and unpredictable. Walking away felt less like rest and more like abandonment. She negotiated a compromise, stepping back from constant oversight while remaining available for critical junctures. Balance, she learned, was not a state but an ongoing practice. On Kepri, the stone cities continued their slow evolution. New structures incorporated materials informed by off-world collaboration, while older ones were preserved as anchors of memory. The resonance of the planet subtly changed, enriched by the interplay of local and distant influences. Some Ket found the expanded soundscape exhilarating, others overwhelming. The Council invested in education that taught not just how to listen, but how to filter, how to choose which vibrations to attend to. Attention, once a given, had become a skill. The broader interstellar context grew more volatile in ways the stewardship network could not fully insulate itself from. Conflicts flared in distant regions, driven by scarcity, ideology, or misunderstanding. Refugee vessels sought safe passage, some finding it through corridors stabilized by the collaborative's work. Each such event tested the network's capacity, forcing participants to decide how far responsibility extended. There were limits, acknowledged openly rather than denied. The existence of limits did not negate the value of what had been built, but it tempered grand narratives. At one point, a proposal surfaced to replicate the Kepri model wholesale across multiple systems, codifying it into a universal framework. The idea was seductive, promising scalability and clarity. It was also met with resistance from those who had lived the process. The Ket Council issued a careful response, cautioning against mistaking principles for templates. What worked at Kepri, they argued, emerged from specific histories and relationships. Exporting it without that context risked creating hollow imitations. Humanity's representatives echoed this concern, some reluctantly, aware of how often their species had erred by imposing solutions rather than cultivating them. Instead, the collaboration began offering mentorship rather than blueprints. Teams traveled to other regions at the invitation of local actors, sharing experiences rather than prescriptions. Sometimes this led to meaningful adaptation. Other times, it revealed incompatibilities that could not be bridged. Failure, when it occurred, was treated as data rather than disgrace. This stance frustrated those who demanded certainty, but it preserved the integrity of the original work. Taev Shun eventually stepped down from their role as mediator, their body bearing the accumulated strain of decades spent absorbing dissonance. Their final address to the Council was characteristically understated. They spoke of continuity not as preservation of form, but of function. Processes would change, participants would come and go, but the commitment to listening must remain. The Council marked their departure with a resonance pattern that carried both gratitude and release, a sound that lingered in the stone long after the chamber emptied. In the years that followed, Kepri ceased to be remarkable in the way first contacts often were. It became known instead as a place where things were done carefully, sometimes slowly, often collaboratively. This reputation deterred some and attracted others. Humanity's association with Kepri became a point of reference, cited in debates about ethics and expansion. It did not define humanity, but it complicated simplistic portrayals. That, perhaps, was its greatest contribution. The debris cloud, once a looming symbol of shared vulnerability, faded into the background of long-term monitoring. It remained there, a reminder that vigilance was ongoing, that no solution was ever final. Younger participants learned of it as history rather than threat, their understanding shaped by stories of cooperation rather than crisis. This shift worried some elders who feared complacency. Others saw it as evidence that the work had succeeded in its quiet way. On a rare occasion when Morado, Quan, and Shun found themselves together again, they did not speak of achievements or legacy. They spoke of fatigue, of moments of doubt, of the strange intimacy forged by shared uncertainty. They acknowledged mistakes without cataloging them, trusting that those who followed would make their own. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with acceptance, a recognition that letting go was as important as holding on. The measure of open hands, once an abstract idea tested by circumstance, had become embedded in practice. It was no longer remarkable to choose restraint over dominance or process over imposition. It was simply one way of being among many, sustained by people willing to do the unglamorous work of maintenance. In a universe crowded with ambition and fear, that choice did not guarantee survival, but it offered a path that did not require others to be diminished for one to endure. As Kepri's star cycled through its phases, flaring and calming in rhythms older than any species present, the stone cities continued to hum. Ships came and went, some pausing to listen, others passing through untouched. Humanity remained what it had always been, inconsistent, inventive, capable of harm and care in equal measure. What Kepri offered was not redemption, but context, a reminder that strength could be measured not only by what one could take or build, but by what one was willing to share and sustain. The story did not end. It settled, as stories rooted in process often did, into the ongoing work of living with consequences and possibilities intertwined. In that settling, there was no grand silence, no cleansing fire. There was simply the continued resonance of open hands, extended not as a gesture of innocence, but as a practiced choice made again and again, in the full knowledge of how easily those hands could close.